And joining us now to talk about the state of Ontario's finances is Jim McCarter. He is the Auditor General of Ontario, and it's good to have you here in TVO.
Good to be here, Steve.
You've got a relative, I mean, you've had the gig for 8 years, but for the last 2 elections, you've had to do something that previous people who had your job never had to do before. Tell us about that.
Well, I have to say, really, it's something that auditors around the world don't do very much of. Normally, we auditors, we're cautious people. We like to audit past transactions, but when the government came in, they basically said, what we'd like to do is put in some legislation and require a government before an election, 6 months before an election, we have fixed election dates in Ontario, to basically forecast, kind of provide a fiscal forecast 3 years out. Good information for the public when they go to the polls. But I think the government also recognized that a lot of voters might be a little bit skeptical, saying, well, you're going to paint a rosy picture. So what they did is I got a call from the finance minister and said, what we'd like to do to provide some credibility to it is have the Auditor General look at that forecast and opine on whether it's reasonable or not. And it's not the normal thing that auditors would do, but I had to say, it was Greg Spare at the time, and I had to say that we'd be happy to do it. It's a bit of a challenge, but I just think as part of the accountability process, it's a good idea.
But let's look at the, I think the history of this was back in 2003 when they had that first election that the Liberals won. They came in and they said, we found this $5.6 billion deficit, right, so all of our projections are off.
Yep.
And I guess they brought you in at that point to have a look at the books.
Yeah, they basically said from here on, we don't want that to happen again. It's happened in other jurisdictions, not just Ontario. And they basically said, you know, we're going to pass legislation requiring a government, whatever government, 6 months before an election, to put out a fiscal forecast and say, here's what we think the state of the fiscal nation is. And to give it some objectivity, we're going to have the Auditor General is going to come out and have a look at it and say, you know what, either I think this is reasonable, or quite frankly, I think this is pie in the sky.
So when you looked at the Liberals' numbers, what did you say?
Well, we looked at, what we're looking at is whether the projected surplus or deficit is fair. So it's kind of, do your revenues make sense? Do your expenses make sense? On the revenue side, Steve, we basically concluded that for the most part, it was a fairly reasonable estimate. Their GDP growth numbers were in line with private sector forecasts.
Well, let's share the numbers here. Hang on one second. We'll just share these right now. Here, this chart going in 2010, 2011, at 106 billion plus in forecasted revenues, and it goes all the way up to 117 billion in the year 2013-2014, and you looked at those and you said, yeah, that's reasonable?
Yeah, we looked at those. We felt they were reasonable. We looked at their GDP growth forecasts, and actually they were a little bit cautious as compared to the private sector average. We also hired a private sector economist out of Ottawa to give it some expert advice. But our sense was basically that what you're looking for, are these in the ballpark? Do we think these are realistically achievable? And we concluded they were on the revenue side.
Do you not worry that it's a little overly optimistic given how unpredictable the economy is everywhere in the world today?
I think the question is, you know, would you have the same conclusion, Auditor, given what we've been hearing about the Greek debt crisis and possible double-dip recession in the United States? My sense is that there's probably enough conservatism built into it that we're going to be so far okay. My sense is the Canadian economy is doing fairly well, but again, you never know. I mean, 2008 came up and kind of really hit people suddenly, so you never know. But I'd have to say, based on the information that I had 3 months ago, and even based on the information that I have now, my sense is still that they're reasonable. I mean, they're not going to hit it bang on, but I think they're in the ballpark.
And of course, if the U.S. housing crisis continues, or even takes a dip for the worse, these numbers are going to be out of date, aren't they?
It could impact them. I'd have to say, and it depends on the different sectors too. The auto sector has a big impact, and it's very much driven by, you know, we export about 85% to the U.S. So, I mean, if they're recession, if they go into a recession, serious recession, that could certainly hit Canada.
Okay, that's the revenue side. Let's take a look at the spending side. This government, the Liberal government, says it's going to spend an average of just 1.8% more in each of the next 3 years.
Yep.
Now, given their track record, do you think that's reasonable?
That's how we looked at it. They have basically spent over the last 8 years on average, they've increased spending 7% every year, year after year. And basically the expenditure forecast that we got, they said we're going to be able to whittle that down to a little less than 2%. And when we looked at the major components of that, we really had to conclude, in the words we used, we felt that it was optimistic and we felt that it was aggressive. And the underlying legislation says that when you do these forecasts, they're supposed to be cautious. We could not conclude that that was a cautious forecast. We felt that basically it was, like I said, optimistic and aggressive, especially if the government's not going to be reducing any services. You know, healthcare, compensation, those are some of the specific areas we mentioned.
Again, we've got a chart here. Let's take a look at it. We'll bring up, here's Ontario program expenses. You want to know where the money goes and how much they've how much the growth rates have been. Here's where it is. Healthcare, 7.1%, actual growth average, and then the projected growth average, 3.6%. They're going to be able to cut health spending in half. Education, 4.8%. It has been. 3% is what they say it will be. Training, 8.6, down to 2.4. Social services, 6.7, down to 3.2. I know you're not a partisan guy,
yep,
but a reasonable person would look at these numbers and, based on the past 8 years, conclude, can this Liberal government hit these targets?
Yeah, I mean, two big areas for us. We looked at compensation. About 50% of total expenditures, whether it's healthcare workers, whether it's teachers, whether it's snowplow operators, it's in the area of compensation. They basically concluded there's going to be no compensation increases, but all you'd have to do is read the paper. You're seeing a lot of compensation increases. So we felt that was pretty optimistic. Healthcare, for instance, doctors' compensation's been going up about 8% a year. They're saying they're going to cut that by more than half. We felt the whole healthcare area, especially you've got an aging population, it's more expensive. And we found the private sector forecasts were basically saying, you know, when you look at healthcare, you're looking at basically population growth. You're looking just inflation alone is about 2 to 2.5%. Utilization is going up with all the technological improvements, and private sector is estimating 6 to 7% a year. It's been about 7% a year, and to come in at, you know, about half that, we just felt that was very aggressive.
Aggressive is a nice way of saying not possible, isn't it?
I think what we said is, and I think in the media scrum, the words I used is you know, you really have to take that with a big grain of salt. And somebody would have to have the rose-colored glasses on to assume that they're going to get there, unless you make the decision that, you know, maybe all the services that we're currently providing people, we're not going to provide, or we're going to institute more user pay type philosophy in there. So you can do it, but where it would be challenging is if you're going to make no cuts at all to your services, to be able to tighten everything up and get that kind of a saving.
That's the kind of thing I think we need to have a better understanding of. And let's be clear here. We're not talking about reducing the amount of money they spend on healthcare. We're talking about reducing the rate of increase at which they intend to spend. But still, to go from a 7.1% increase in health spending annually to just 3.6%, can you give us a sense of what kind of services would have to be cut to meet that target?
You know, in essence, what they'd be doing is to be going out to a hospital or even different sectors like a Children's Aid Society, for instance, and basically saying, we're only going to be giving you this much money. We're not giving you any money for compensation increases. If, you know, your nurses are getting a compensation increase, for instance, you've got to find the money elsewhere. So what does a hospital do? Either they have to, quote, find the inefficiencies that are already in the system, or they have to start looking at basically saying, well, you know what, maybe I'm going to have one less triage nurse in emergency, so when people come in, it takes you a bit longer to get triaged. Those are the decisions that are going to have to be made. Maybe on the drug benefits plan, they basically say to people, we're not going to be paying for all the drugs we used to pay. Those are going to be some of the hard decisions that I think they may be faced with. I mean, hopefully they can do it, but we just felt it was very aggressive.
Given that so much of public spending is, in fact, on salaries, if you froze salaries, and I don't know how possible it is to do that, but if you froze salaries, how close would that get you to your targets?
That would help. That wouldn't get you all the way there. It certainly wouldn't get you all the way there, but it would help if you froze salaries. Now, again, they've got to face the decision, you know, if we freeze doctors' compensation, our doctor's going to say, well, I'm not working any more Fridays. You know, school teachers, nurses, is that feasible? I mean, they could do it. They could pass legislation, but that would get them part of the way there, but in my opinion, not all the way there.
Now, I don't know that it's part of your mandate to look at the promises that the three main parties, I guess Greens too, four main parties, put out there before election campaigns. But based on what you've heard, seen, considered, had thrust under your nose, can you make a comment as to how wise the promises are, fiscally speaking?
Yeah. I have to be honest. I probably not even, as you mentioned at the start, we're very nonpartisan, and I try to be extremely nonpartisan. And I'm not even that familiar with the promises that they are making. And again, you know, when they get into power, whichever government gets into power, they're going to have to face, you know, some pretty harsh reality as to whether this is doable. And I know they've hired Don Drummond to have a look at this. And
I'm so glad you raised his name, because that's exactly where we want to go right now. Don Drummond, former TD Bank economist, of course, says no matter who forms the government on the 7th of October, they are going to find themselves in a profoundly deep fiscal hole. And he's not sure that any of the parties that has a chance to win this election understands how deep that hole is going to be. Do you agree with that?
Actually, Don came in and we met, and we had quite a good chat for about an hour, I guess a few weeks ago. And you know, we talked a bit about that, and that was my sense, that to be able to achieve these forecasts, and they're fairly big deficits. It's not like we're forecasting a break-even situation. We're forecasting a $16 billion deficit in 12, down to 14, down to 13. These are still like big deficits, and we're basically saying, boy, this is going to be very challenging. And I think that's what Mr. Drummond is saying, that somebody's going to have to face the, you know, the harshness of the reality when they get in.
Here's what Adam Radwanski in the Globe and Mail wrote about your report when it came out back in June. He said, if the next government is going to have to make some harder decisions, and the auditor's report suggests that it will, there's an argument that politicians should be leading the public rather than following it. That way, voters could get some say in what they're willing to pay more for and what they're willing to make do with less of. Mr. McCarter couldn't say all that, of course. It's not his mandate, but it's the obvious subtext of his report. Has he got you right?
My sense is, to be able to meet those numbers, it's going to be extremely challenging unless you decide you're going to look at the way government perhaps delivers services, unless you're going to look at, you know, maybe there's some things we can't provide all things to all people. I think that's the scenario that they're probably going to be in. And those are some tough, and I'd have to say probably some unpopular decisions that may have to be made.
Politicians are notorious for not wanting to break the bad news to voters. This is going to cost more. We're going to have to cut that service. Do you have a role to play in this?
Basically, when it comes to how much money is spent, that's essentially a policy decision. And our job is whether whether the deficit is $20 billion or whether it's a surplus of $20 billion, that's really a government policy decision. Where we come in is, are they spending the money cost effectively? We go out every year and we focus very much not on financial auditing, but what I call value for money auditing. We'll go into hospitals, everything the government does to get an assessment as to, are you spending the money cost effectively? How do we compare to other jurisdictions?
No, I hear you on that. I hear you. But you know, Sheila Fraser, who was of course your federal counterpart for so many years, who just left the job, I mean, she might have been the most trusted public figure in Canada. And she used the bully pulpit of her position in order to kind of get some truth-telling going on. Do you feel that you can do that?
My sense is, I think auditors do have quite a bit of clout. I know Sheila and I've talked about this, you know, quite a bit, and I think Sheila was very, you know, very respected. But my sense is that when we say something, we get a lot of action, and the deputies and the ministers take it very seriously. And so we do have a fair bit of clout. But by the same token, you know, we have to be responsible when we use that clout. But I'm pretty comfortable that certainly the current government has listened, you know, when we've come out and said, you know what, we think you need to do things differently or have a look at this.
Okay, let me come full circle here and finish up where we started, which was we talked about the fact that you now have it as part of your mandate to look at the books of every government 6 months before it goes to the polls in an election. You've done it twice now. In terms of a service to voters, how useful do you think the exercise really is?
I think it depends to a large extent on, you know, does the media pick it up? Is the media interested? And I know for a couple of days it got a fair bit of attention that, you know, the auditor basically come out and said, boy, you know, these expenditure estimates are pretty optimistic, they're pretty aggressive, you're going to have a tough time meeting it. Now, whether that's in the minds of the voters when they come into the polls, you know, in October, you know, who's to say? But I think just having that information out there, first of all, I think it's a good exercise to force the government before an election to come out and actually put pen to paper and say, this is the fiscal state of the nation. I just think that's a great accountability mechanism. And I'm also, being an auditor, I'm obviously a bit skeptical myself. I think it's also a great accountability mechanism to say, you know what, we want someone independent that's pretty knowledgeable about government finances to have a look at it and say, you know what, this is reasonable, or quite frankly, it's pie in the sky. I just think it's a good piece of legislation.
That's Jim McCarter, Auditor General of Ontario, and it's good of you to visit us at TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve.